Dawn lifts over an unfinished nation, a sweep of grasslands waking to frost, mountains holding their breath, cities still lit by lamps and hunger. Between them lies distance, the American kind, measured not only in miles but in time, in cost, in hope deferred. In that distance, fortunes are made and lost. In that distance, a country decides what it can become. Lay a sheet on a table, paper thin as a winter leaf, and unroll a blueprint. Lines appear, tentative pencil strokes, then firmer, darker, bolder. Each line is an argument, each curve is a wager against gravity, weather, and the limits of men. Follow one line from river to prairie to pass to tidewater. It does not choose the land by force. It asks what the land will accept. Towns gather along it like iron filings around a magnet. Granaries rise, freight rates drop. A farmer's harvest that once rotted in a distant bin now meets a ship before the season turns. This is the wager of rail. That steel, properly placed, can reorder a map and a destiny. That time can be shortened, risk tamed, prices bent toward growth. That a nation stitched with track becomes not a scattering of frontiers, but a single market with a single heartbeat. The stakes are absolute: ruin in a bad winter, triumph in a good harvest, fame for a lucky few, punishment for the reckless many. Capital will demand an answer, regulators will come, late but insistent, weather will not care, the timetable will. At the edge of that blueprint stands an immigrant with ledgers under his arm and a root in his head that others do not see. He has learned the arithmetic of distance from warehouses and wharves, invoices and grain sacks. He has learned that the cheapest mile is the one never laid, and the strongest line is the one the land itself allows. He carries no myth of easy conquest, only a hard belief in surveys, grades, tonnage, and the discipline to say no when spectacle tempts yes. Call the line what it will become, a spine of steel. Call the man what history will later name him. But here, at first light, he is simply James J. Hill, staring at a blank stretch of continent and seeing, before anyone else, the clean, continuous line that can bind it together. 1. Origins, arrival, hunger, and the first ledgers. He was born in farm country, where the dirt under a boy's nails could be as permanent as a surname. Aramosa Township, Upper Canada, near Guelph, September 16, 1838. Irish immigrant parents, tight means, and then a childhood accident, a bow and arrow mishap that blinded his right eye. He grew with a squint and a habit of leaning close to the page. His father died when he was 14. School ended, and work began. The boy who loved arithmetic and clean pen lines left Rockwood Academy with a ledger keeper's hands and a freight man's future. The name on the register was James Jerome Hill. In 1856, barely 18, he crossed the border and stepped onto the St. Paul levee, a rim of mud and urgency at the head of Mississippi steamboat navigation. Hill took a clerk's post with a river outfit, counting bales, rating barrels, logging cargo by dock light. The river taught lessons that school could not. That distance is measured not only in miles, but in draft, sandbars, and the season's temper. That a missed schedule breaks trust as surely as a broken wheel. He learned the cost of an hour and the value of a promise written on a bill of lading. By 1860, he had moved from the waterline to the city's freighting nerve, handling transfers for wholesale grocers, where rails met river and where the real arithmetic lived. He was still a bookkeeper by title, but the books he kept were a map of the interior. What a bushel of wheat could bear, what a ton of iron was worth against a mile of wagon road or a day lost to weather. Winter froze the Mississippi, and when the packets stopped, he bid on other contracts, studying how price and time could be bent by ingenuity. The habits of an empire builder began as the habits of a hustling clerk. St. Paul was not merely a town, it was a hinge. To the north lay the Red River country and Fort Garry, soon Winnipeg, where fur and then grain pooled, waiting for a way out. Since the 1850s, Red River carts, ox-drawn, shrieking wood on wood, had creaked along the trails between Prairie and Riverport. When the river ran high enough, steamboats could push a floating warehouse through the grasslands. Hill watched the timetables of water and wagons and saw the same pattern again and again. Demand arriving before capacity, perishable hope riding on unreliable means. He made a private vow that the hinge would become a lock and the lock a door. He diversified, first in fuel. In 1867, he entered the coal trade, the quiet, dirty business that powers all the glamorous ones. Coal was the truth behind motion. No fire, no movement, no market. Hill cultivated the knack of being early where energy would be dear. Within a decade, he was the dominant anthracite supplier in St. Paul, not by miracle, but by margins. Buying shrewdly, cutting waste, mastering storage, and understanding that every needless handling of a ton was money bled. Coal sharpened his sense of throughput, the gospel he would later preach in steel. Then came the Red River itself. In 1870, Hill and partners launched the Red River Transportation Company, pushing steamboats north into the prairie season after season. When Norman Kitson, fur trader, river captain, and natural ally, joined forces with him, they folded rivals and stitched a near monopoly on that watery corridor from St. Paul to Fort Garry. What mattered to Hill was not the boast, but the data. Manifests swelling with grain, lumber, and immigrants, turnarounds compressing, freight rates responding to competition, the prairie writing its needs into his ledgers. He was learning where the traffic wanted to go before a single rail of his own had been spiked. The levee and the counting house became his university. From invoices and weather logs, he distilled a theory of American distance. Shorten the route, smooth the grade, keep the curvature low, and never lay a mile. You cannot keep full in both directions. He came to prefer the thrift of a good route over the romance of a grand one. He would talk about rates and grades the way a farmer talks about soil, what it can bear, what it needs to yield. He learned that the cheapest car to move is the one that does not idle, that timetables are contracts, and that profits accumulate in the quiet inches where waste used to be. Bank boards followed. So did equity in small, ailing ventures that he repaired and sold, building capital and credibility. But behind the deals was a single obsession: continuity. Hill despised breaks in a route. Ice in winter, mud in spring, low water in late summer, court injunctions any time they pleased. He kept returning to the same picture. St. Paul as the throat, the Red River Valley as the lungs, and a body that wanted to breathe all the way to the Pacific. He didn't yet have a railroad, but he did have a diagnosis. The Northwest was sick from discontinuity. The cure would be a continuous line that obeyed the land instead of defying it. Opportunity arrived disguised as wreckage. The panic of 1873 had broken many roads, and among the fragments lay the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, short, mismanaged, and snarled in receiverships and lawsuits. Hill studied it for years, the way an engineer studies a river, soundings, shoals, seasons, the places where a small cut might change the current. He gathered a syndicate: Kitson, Donald Smith, George Stephen, John Stuart Kennedy, men with money, reach, and appetites. The plan was not merely rescue. It was rerouting the destiny of a region by taking a weak line and making it a backbone. In 1878, they struck, taking control of the nearly bankrupt road. In 1879, they reorganized it as the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba. Hill was general manager, then president. The title mattered less than the mandate he gave himself: make a railway that could be kept mile by mile by the mathematics of traffic and the discipline of design. Do not reach for the mountains until the prairie and valley can feed the rails. Build towns as waypoints and customers, not ornaments. Spend where curvature steals capacity. Save where scenery tempts pride. Above all, make the line pay as it grows, a living organism, not a paper empire. This, then, was the origin of the route others did not see. It was not a flash of insight at a summit, but a decade of ledgers, manifests, winter freezes, and river stages. It was the patience of a man who had watched the prairie miss its markets by weeks and dollars, and believed that the difference between want and plenty could be engineered. When James J. Hill finally put pencil to blueprint, he was not guessing. He was recalling the quiet arithmetic of 1,000 dockside decisions and laying the first mental mile of a line that would bind a continent. 2. The blueprint, surveys, capital, and the route through the wild. Before the gangs, before the bridges and the winter fires in section tents, there had to be a route, something bolder than a guess and humbler than a boast. Hill's rule was simple enough to fit on the back of a waybill: the shortest distance, the lowest grades, the least curvature you can build, because every needless foot, every unnecessary inch of rise, and every wasted degree of bend would be paid for forever. We do not care enough for Rocky Mountain scenery, he said, to spend a large sum of money developing it. The line would honor physics, not postcards. Capital came first because survey stakes don't stand up without money behind them. The carcass he chose to reanimate, the St. Paul and Pacific, was rich in rights of way, but poor in everything else, a casualty of the panic of 1873 and years of legal snarl. Hill had watched it from the levee and the counting house, taking soundings like a riverman. When the moment opened, he assembled a syndicate with faces he trusted and pockets deep enough for winter. Norman Kitson, his old Red River ally, Donald Smith and George Stephen of Montreal banking and Hudson's Bay renown, and New York financier John S. Kennedy, who understood the Dutch bondholders' labyrinth. In 1878, they seized control. In 1879, they refashioned the wreck as the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, St. PM and M, with Hill at the throttle. The new name mattered less than the new arithmetic. Extend, upgrade, and make each mile earn its keep. The first drawings looked modest: knit the wheat country to the riverheads and lake ports, close the seasonal gaps that froze commerce, and lay branch lines only where two-way traffic, grain out, lumber, and goods back, could be proved. Hill reinvested profits ruthlessly into ballast, alignment, and heavier rail, because a poor track is a leaking bucket. He treated towns as both customers and components: elevators, mills, stockyards, and coal docks, stitched into the timetable so that trains departed full in both directions. This was not empire by flourish, but by throughput. Then the paper map ran west until it buckled against the Cordillera. If the line was to become a true spine, the passes had to yield, not to money, but to reconnaissance. Hill sent a young engineer, John F. Stevens, after a rumor the old explorers had never nailed down, a low break in the northern Rockies spoken of by native travelers and traders. In December 1889, traveling light in midwinter, Stevens found it, the long-suspected Marias Pass, broad-bottomed, gentle of grade, a natural door across the divide. In that moment, the blueprint gained a hinge, a crossing that would spare Hill the ruinous curvature and tunneling that had bankrupted other dreams. A route through the Cascades demanded similar discipline. Stevens again traced the least worst path, laying out a temporary set of switchbacks over the summit that would open the way to Puget Sound, while economics caught up to engineering. The long-term fix, a tunnel, could be justified only when traffic proved it. Efficiency first, spectacle never. Behind the survey parties walked the bankers and the bookkeepers. Hill's case to capital was not romance, it was rate sheets and car counts. Here is the wheat, here the timber, here the cattle, here the coal. Here are the grades that will let one locomotive do the work of two. Here the curvature we will shave to raise a train's tonnage by the quiet miracle of physics. Build where the land will carry you cheaply, refuse where it will forever tax you. He was not shy about scale, only about waste. The financing was notable for what it lacked. Where rival transcontinentals had seized vast federal land grants and then chased their own subsidies into bankruptcy court, Hill's road would be built chiefly on private capital and operating profits. The only free lands that ever passed to the Great Northern came by purchase of predecessor lines. The strategy instead was to buy government land at fair price, promote settlement, and make the railroad earn by moving what those settlers grew. It was slower than a subsidy binge, and far sturdier. Blueprints turned to field books and field books to stakes. Surveyors walked the prairie to find the lines the wind had already drawn, watersheds to follow, ridges to avoid, bottoms to cross in winter when they were hardest and cheapest. The rules of thumb were brutal and exact. Every 0.1% you steal from a ruling grade is a dividend for 30 years. Every degree you take out of a curve is a crew you won't need in perpetuity. Town plats were penciled where water, fuel, and sidings made sense. Not every 7 miles for vanity, not every desert crossroads for politics, but where the line's metabolism demanded a place to breathe. In September 1889, with the prairie net largely woven and the Rocky Mountain key in hand, Hill gave the parent company its new national name, the Great Northern Railway. It was a christening, but also a claim, a promise that this route would be a continuous fact from St. Paul to Tidewater, a private transcontinental bound together by grades and geometry instead of subsidies and slogans. The documents from those months read like sermons to engineers. Keep the lines straight, keep the grade down, keep the money in the road, spend where curvature steals speed, harden the subgrade where frost heaves your profits into the ditch. Put section houses where a storm can trap a crew, water tanks where a thirsty engine would force a meet. If a town wants a station, show it the traffic. If a politician wants a detour, show him the grade profile. The mathematics of prudence would rule the map. By the time the blueprint reached the mountain's far shadows, it contained more than a path. It held a theory of a region. The Red River Valley would be granary and trunk. Montana's benches would fill with wheat. The Milk and Missouri would feed eastbound tonnage. Washington's timber and Puget Sound's ships would answer westbound. Immigration agencies would be instructed where to point the new arrivals. Colonist cars would bring them. Credit and seed would be arranged so that next year's crop would be heavier than this year's. The railroad was both a road and a recipe. And yet, in 1890, it was still lines on paper and stakes in snow, an audacious promise backed by capital surveys and the conviction that efficiency is a form of mercy in hard country. What remained was the part blueprints cannot do: the iron, the trestles, the telegraph, the men, and the weather. The build would either vindicate Hill's arithmetic or expose it. The map was ready to be made of steel. 3. The build: iron, timber, labor, and brutal weather. Before the locomotives there was handwork: axe, auger, sledge. In Minnesota, Hill proved that careful engineering could be beautiful without being wasteful. His stone arch bridge over the Mississippi at St. Anthony Falls, masonry and patient arcs of local granite and limestone, tied the milling city's traffic to his rails and taught a lesson he never forgot. A strong, straight approach pays for itself every day it stands. The skeptics called it Hill's folly, until the ledgers converted them. Then the line went west and the work grew raw. Survey stakes became timber bents became trestles became fills. Crews cut grades to the 0.25% because every unnecessary rise would be taxed forever by gravity. Ballast was tamped where frost would heave profits into the ditch. Rail was laid heavy where curvature wanted to steal speed. The instructions were monotonous by design: straighten, drain, brace, repeat. Waste nothing that must be carried for 30 years. The crews were a crowd of accents: Scandinavians newly landed from Hill's own colonist cars, Irish and Canadians from the older roads, Yankees chasing wages, Métis and French from the Red River country. In the Dakotas and Montana, they drove ties into prairie sod and hardpan. In the timber of Washington, they felled fir that became their own scaffolds. At night in section tents, a dozen languages argued the same problem: snow tomorrow and a culvert not yet cribbed. Hill's recruitment machine, agencies in Europe, cheap fares west, the promise of land and town sites, fed not only farms but the gangs themselves. The railroad was building its own future customer base as it built its roadbed. By 1890, the blueprint met mountains. John F. Stevens's winter discovery of Marias Pass gave the line a door through the Rockies broad enough to bring a transcontinental without ruinous grades or long tunnels. The Great Northern's graders followed his notes as if they were scripture, hugging the valley bottoms, letting the middle fork of the Flathead show where the railroad should breathe. In August 1890, construction began toward the pass. Each mile west was a bet placed with shovel and spike that the arithmetic would hold. The Cascades did not yield so easily. Stevens set out another solution: an interim ladder of switchbacks clawing over the crest to open the way to Puget Sound, with a promise that the economics of traffic would one day justify a tunnel. Snow sheds sprouted like wooden armor where slides came down. Section crews learned to swing a shovel at 3 a.m. to clear a drift before the timetable broke. Only in 1900 did the first Cascade Tunnel punch through, retiring the switchbacks that had done their brutal temporary work. Winter wrote itself into the rulebook. 50 feet of snow on the High Line was not a myth, but a measurement. Avalanches did not negotiate. The company invested in rotary plows that could bite a canyon back out of a drift and in telegraph discipline strict enough to keep men and iron separated by minutes instead of luck. A bad storm could still close a district, but the expectation, Hill's expectation, was that the line reopened because crews had been stationed where storms were likely, not where landscapes were pretty. Everywhere the work ran on a cadence: fell timber, hew ties, set bents, crib, lay fish plates, spike, tamp. Build water tanks where a thirsty engine would force a meet, set section houses where a snowbound gang wouldn't perish before help arrived. Place sidings where two opposing freights could pass without stealing half an hour from the day. The telegraph clicked orders by the minute. The timetable was a law older than any statute. We do not care enough for Rocky Mountain scenery to spend a large sum of money developing it, Hill had said. The men could feel that sentence in their shoulders. The economics of the line were built into the dirt. Eastbound, wheat from the Red River and Montana benches that Hill was simultaneously advertising to settlers. Timber from Puget Sound. Once Hill cut a bargain that made Frederick Weyerhaeuser's logs flow like a second river. Cattle and copper as the region matured. Westbound, coal, manufactured goods, rails, the stuff of towns. The goal was simple and ruthless: keep cars full in both directions, because an empty car is a confession. There were accidents and there was improvisation. A false face gave way on a cut near a frozen creek. A trestle bent under an overloaded work train and had to be scabbed together overnight from timber that had been intended for a depot. When a bridge pier settled, the engineer on site jacked the span with cribbing built out of ties and curses, then flagged trains over at walking speed until the masonry could be rebuilt in spring. The railroad's memory was a ledger of such field decisions: what to do when the wind shifts, when the thaw comes early, when a crew is good but the timber is not. The proud moments were quiet, even bureaucratic. A new rule tightened the maximum curvature in a district. A superintendent ordered heavier rail on a ruling grade. A treasurer signed for more ballast because the last 2 winters had been unkind. Every one of those decisions turned into a train that left on time 6 months later. Hill drove his officers to spend on what the tonnage would pay back and to abstain where it would never. The cheapest mile was still the one never laid. The second cheapest was the mile that didn't need a helper engine. The day came when the temporary rungs over the Cascades reached each other. In the winter of 1892-93, gangs working from east and west closed the gap high above a gorge near a hamlet aptly named Scenic. A photograph from that season shows men with snow to their boot tops and rail to their knees, laying the last lengths over a pass the old maps had merely guessed at. On January 7, 1893, the Great Northern reached Seattle. The private transcontinental that Hill had promised on paper became a schedule you could set a clock by. Completion did not mean rest. The panic of 1893 arrived almost with the inaugural trains, and where other transcontinentals toppled into receivership, Hill drove costs down without letting the line rot. Wages cuts triggered strikes. Arbitration followed. He gave ground, more than his reputation would predict. But the operating principle held: keep the tracks sound, the grades light, the bridges honest, the cars full, and the company would survive the cycle. It did. In the end, the build was less about hammers than habits. Anyone with money can buy rails. The question is whether you can lay them where the land will keep them and the traffic will feed them. Hill's answer was a culture. surveyors who believed 0.1% was a moral question, foremen who measured progress by bad miles eliminated, dispatchers who treated an on-time meet in a blizzard as a sacrament. Across the prairies, over Marias, up and over the Cascades, that culture made a paper line into a living road. When the map finally showed a continuous thread from St. Paul to Puget Sound, it did not brag. It breathed. Grain rode the rails to salt water before the frost returned. Eastbound cars of timber and fish and finished goods met westbound cars of coal and machinery, and the line's pulse evened out into commerce. The build had been a war with weather, grade, and time. The victory was measured in something quieter, a timetable that kept its promises. 4. The War for the West, Rivals, Rate Wars, and Regulation. A railroad is never alone. The moment Hill's steel reached saltwater, competitors moved like weather fronts. From the south came the Union Pacific-Oregon lines, hungry for the Columbia and Puget Sound. From the parallel North Belt came the Northern Pacific, heavy with land grants and debt, determined to keep the prairie and timber to itself. Every elevator, every pier, every junction was a contested border. The weapon was price. The battlefield was the timetable. Rate sheets turned into manifestos. Wheat could move for a penny less per ton-mile today and 2 pennies more next month. Lumber that flowed east at a bargain could choke your westbound return with empties if you misread the season. Shippers learned to play one road against another. Railroads learned the oldest bad habit in the book: rebates for the big customer, discrimination against the small. Farmers and merchants had seen this movie before and would not forgive a sequel. Their anger, organized in grange halls, co-ops, and city boards of trade, hardened into a new American idea: that a private timetable could set public terms and therefore deserved public rules. Congress answered in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Act, and its new referee, the Interstate Commerce Commission, charged to pry open secret rates, ban rebates, and police reasonable and just charges across state lines. It was the first industry-wide federal regulator in U.S. history. The law did not end rivalry, it civilized the terms of battle. In Hill's country, the fight began with geography and ended with capitalization. His Great Northern, built chiefly on private capital and operating profits, without the vast federal land grants that propped up rivals, could afford to price tightly so long as its costs were honest and its grades were light. The Northern Pacific, by contrast, carried a different inheritance: earlier subsidies, heavier debt, repeated reorganizations. One road had been engineered to earn, the other, too often, to justify bonds. The marketplace noticed. In the 1890s, when a national panic toppled lines across the Northwest, Seattle papers could list the bankrupts and receiverships by the column, and then add a single exception: Great Northern trains still keeping time. But beating a rival on rates was only half the game. The other half was position. Chicago was the Republic's throat, and the Burlington, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, was the cleanest pipe to it from the upper plains. In 1901, Hill moved to buy the Burlington at $200 a share, bringing J.P. Morgan's deep capital in the Northern Pacific as a partner. E. H. Harriman of the Union Pacific would not accept that geometry. He lunged not at the Burlington, but at the Northern Pacific itself, raiding its stock to force a seat at Hill's table and possibly control of the Northwest. For a few days in May, the New York market went mad as Short sellers were trapped, and Northern Pacific shares traded at prices few thought possible. History's most famous stock corner written in ticker tape. The panic subsided only when the giants agreed to stop trying to bury each other with the same shovel. The truce produced a structure, Northern Securities Company, a holding company designed to sit above the Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and their hard-won Burlington link. From Hill's point of view, it was efficiency by other means, coordinated traffic, rational rates, the end of destructive parallelism. From Washington's point of view, especially Theodore Roosevelt's, it smelled like a trust. The Justice Department sued in 1902 under the Sherman Antitrust Act. 2 winters later, by a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court ordered Northern Securities dissolved, declaring that the combination restrained interstate commerce in violation of the law. The holding company died. The lesson lived. Private geometry would be measured against public purpose, and if the lines overlapped too neatly, the government would redraw them. Regulation thickened. The Elkins Act of 1903 struck at the old disease of rebates, the secret refunds that let the powerful shipper name his own price and left the small man to carry the margin. 3 years later, the Hepburn Act gave the ICC something sharper than moral suasion, authority to set maximum just and reasonable rates after a hearing, to standardize bookkeeping, to require reports, and to extend its reach to terminals, ferries, and pipelines. In 1910, the Mann-Elkins Act shifted the burden of proof to the railroads themselves. No longer could a company assume that a published rate was right until someone proved it wrong. The railroad had to prove it was right at the outset. The ICC had been born a referee. By the new century, it had acquired a whistle, a rule book, and a penalty box. Hill argued sometimes in public hearings and sometimes in the calmer language of correspondence that prudence and physics should be the judge. Lighter grades, broader curves, sound roadbed, these made low rates sustainable. Political ceilings did not. He claimed he could move a bushel cheaper because he had built the line that way, not because a clerk in Washington ordered it, but even he could not wish the structure away. The new framework made peace less about handshake pools and more about filings and findings. It pressed the industry toward consistency, visibility, and, when necessary, compulsion. The age of private rate wars was ending. The age of regulated corridors had arrived. What did the war for the West look like on the ground? In elevators and town halls, it meant farmers demanding that a bushel of wheat grown 2 counties from the main line not be taxed by a branch line's monopoly, that a long-haul rate not undercut a short-haul simply because competition was fiercer at the distant port. In mills and docks, it meant shippers insisting that a published tariff be the price for all, not just a number for the unsuspecting, while the big customer got a quiet envelope back. In the dispatcher's offices, it meant trains scheduled to realize the arithmetic of the route, cars full east and west, so that a reasonable rate could be earned, not guessed. In the courtroom, it meant lawyers translating gradients and curvature into exhibits labeled Exhibit C. The romance of the West narrowed into columns of figures. Hill still fought like an operator. He sharpened the Great Northern's balance sheet, upgraded track, and invested in terminals that eliminated the last-mile clogs that waste a day's work before a ship can be loaded. He leaned hard into the Burlington connection to make Chicago as natural to his map as St. Paul. He bargained with timber and mining interests so that westbound capacity wouldn't bleed away in empties. He understood that the best answer to regulation was performance. Trains that ran, bridges that did not fail, claims that did not multiply, customers who, when asked, could say the service they bought arrived when and how they were promised. It sounds simple. It is not. It is culture. Rivals learned too. Harriman modernized, the Northern Pacific stabilized under Morgan's conventional discipline. New entrants and old locals made tactical pushes into valleys and over lesser passes. The competition became less about flamboyant construction and more about the invisible parts of a railroad: dispatching, maintenance cycles, locomotive assignment, the alignment of a siding so perfect you never notice the meat you didn't have to wait for. The public got fewer headlines and better service. The regulators got fewer scandals and thicker filings. The era of the headline-grabbing spike was over. The era of quiet improvements began. Yet the costs were not footnotes. Cheap rates that carried settlers also carried dispossession. Rights of way that made towns possible also split older trails and older claims. Grain reached ocean faster, so did change. Labor asked for more of the peace it helped make: safer cuts, fewer hours, steadier wages. When panics came, 1893, then 1901, the railroad economy translated national fear into local facts. A shutdown mill, an empty platform, a house for sale. Hill's boast was survival without receivership. His admission was that even the best-run road could not repeal the weather of finance. The West was won, but it was never gentle. By the middle years of the new century's first decade, the map of the northern tier looked less like a tangle and more like a braid. Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Burlington still competed, but the terms were clearer. Publish the tariff, keep the promises, argue your case before the commission if you must. The old war for the West had not ended in a single victory. It had ended in a settlement, a moving one, between physics, finance, and law. Hill, who believed that the cheapest mile is the one you never lay, and the next cheapest is the straight one, could live with that. Not happily, always, but he could live with it. Because beneath the lawsuits and the rate cases, the reason for the road remained unchanged. Wheat met ships before the frost. Timber and flesh and ore moved on schedules that tied a prairie noon to a tide chart at dawn. Towns found their place on a timetable as real as longitude. Rivals shifted, merged, and re-emerged. Regulators expanded, contracted, and in later decades would even be abolished and reborn under new names. But in Hill's day, the pattern set. Vision bounded by rules, enterprise measured by law, a private line crossing public ground with obligations to both. That was the truce the West required. That was the war's true end. 5. Consequences and legacy, towns, markets, and the human cost. A railroad redraws maps, but its real work is quieter. It rearranges daily life. As the Great Northern schedule settled, prairie depots became addresses and addresses became towns. Water tanks and sidings hardened into main streets. An agent's bay window became the center of a small universe. On the northern plains, place names recorded the enterprise that birthed them. Minot for Henry D. Minot, an investor and Hill friend. Williston for Daniel Willis James, another ally whose fortune underwrote risk. Havre for Le Havre, spoken with a French echo by settlers who wanted a haven under the high line's wind. Shelby, a junction and an argument with geography, took the name of a Montana Central executive whose road knit the Great Falls country to Hill's trunk. The timetable was turning into a gazetteer. Markets followed the rails because rails disciplined price, time, and distance. Wheat from the Red River and Montana benches now had a clock and a buyer. The path to salt water ran west to Puget Sound as naturally as a river seeks sea. After Great Northern reached Seattle in 1893, Trans-Pacific steamship lines stitched Hill's rails to Asian ports. Grain, flour, lumber, and salmon moved out while textiles, tea, and manufactured goods moved in. Business was a choreography, cars full both ways, elevators that didn't idle, docks that loaded to a tide table. The new geometry made a town's fortunes depend not on isolation, but on connection. Hill's Road had been built chiefly without federal land grants, a deliberate rejection of the subsidy habit that had wrecked so many balance sheets. The claim was never that the Great Northern owned no land at all. Predecessor lines conveyed some rights, but that the transcontinental core was financed on private capital and operating profit, which forced discipline mile by mile. The reward was resilience, a business that could lower rates because physics and track work, not treasury favors, kept costs down. It was a different model, and in the long run, it mattered. Settlement was not accidental. The company organized immigration bureaus and later an agricultural development department to teach dryland methods, sponsor demonstration plots, and publish advice on seed, stock, and shelter belts. Colonist cars, Spartan coaches priced for families with more courage than cash, ran in season toward surveyed town sites and advertised soils. The program had a double logic. Farmers got a foothold. The railroad got traffic, eastbound and westbound, that justified heavier rail and straighter line. In the Pacific Northwest, the railroad's reach unlocked a second economy. In 1900, Hill brokered one of the largest land transactions in American history, the sale of 900,000 acres of Washington timberlands, assembled through Northern Pacific land grants and later under Hill's control, to Frederick Weyerhuser, who organized a new timber company around the purchase. Logs rolled to mills, lumber rolled to depots and docks. A city like Seattle found itself set not just on a sound, but on a continent. The deal cemented an east-west rhythm, forest to saw, saw to ship to markets that now seemed next door because the map had been reheard in ton miles. But the ledger had a human column that never closed. On the Cascades, winter of 1910 wrote itself in black ice and thunder. At Wellington, after days of blizzard, a lightning-loosed slab took 2 stalled Great Northern trains off the mountain like toys. 96 dead, passengers and railroaders, carried down on toboggans after the weather relented. Snow sheds and a longer tunnel would follow, engineering remedies for an accusation written by gravity. Yet the memory remained a caution about what it means to run a schedule where avalanches hold the timetable in their fist. The costs were older than any bridge. The Northern Transcontinental crossed homelands. The High Line's empty spaces had languages and laws before the surveyor's chain, and change pressed hard. On the east side of the future, Glacier National Park, Blackfeet lands were reduced by an 1895 cession of the mountainous strip. After the park was created in 1910, the railroad's hotels and chalets sold the scenery with a Swiss dream and a staged version of native life that drew tourists even as the original uses of the country were curtailed. The company's development arm built trails and lodges with zeal. The park's identity fused preservation to pageant, and the Blackfeet were cast as vanishing hosts at the edge of their own story. Progress had a face and a bill. Labor, too, exacted its price. When the Panic of 1893 forced wage cuts, Hill pushed hard. His men pushed back. In April 1894, the American Railway Union struck the Great Northern and, unusually in that bitter decade, won restoration of wages through arbitration, the rare settlement that admitted a railroad could be both solvent and fairer at once. The lesson was not sentimental. It was operational. Crews that trusted the rulebook, the pay sheet, and the dispatcher did better work in a blizzard than men who felt the company's word was a trap. The road's influence reached culture as well as commerce. By 1910, the railway promoted Glacier National Park as an alpine wonderland with chalets, backcountry trails, and grand hotels, architecture chosen to frame American mountains as a European romance while pulling tourist traffic onto varnished trains. The signature passenger streamliner that came later took its name from Hill's own sobriquet, the Empire Builder, a rolling acknowledgement that the business of binding places together leaves a story as well as a schedule. In Seattle, the rails recalibrated the waterfront. The year Hill's steel reached tidewater, the city was still rebuilding from fire and living at the mercy of Eastern capital. Within 3 years, regular Asian steamship service meshed with the Great Northern, and exports surged. The city's role as gateway to wheat, lumber, and later to the Klondike took on rail-assisted inevitability. The prosperity was sharp and uneven. When national finance seized in 1893, the boom turned bust with an abruptness that stripped storefronts and scattered families. Still, the infrastructure remained. Tunnels under downtown, piers aligned to rail, a harbor that could swing from despair to frenzy when the ships returned. If the Great Northern's operating creed, shorter, straighter, lighter grade, sounds like a technicality, its social consequence was anything but. Cheaper haulage made marginal acres pencil out. Timetables shaped school terms and market days. Letters and newspapers rode in baggage cars that outran winter. A farmer who once guessed at prices from rumor could now ship on a date and argue a rate with a sheet of paper in hand. The railroad's own filings, before the Interstate Commerce Commission and in courts, translated gradients into public obligations. By imposing visibility on the business, regulation also imposed visibility on the landscape of winners and losers. Over decades, Hill's map outlived Hill. The Great Northern, the Northern Pacific, and the Burlington, roads he fought, bought, or bound, merged in 1970 as Burlington Northern. A generation later, that system joined the Santa Fe to form BNSF. The names changed. The Northern Transcontinental endured as an artery for grain, containers, oil, and ideas. On today's dispatch boards, you can still trace the old logic in the meats and the fast freights, the straight mile that saves a helper, the gentler grade that saves a set-out, the siding placed where it steals the least from the day. So what remains, beyond iron and habit? Towns that would not be there without a water tank and a siding in 1890. A seaboard city that learned to think like a continent because a private line gave it a hinterland. A park whose chalets and trails tell both the story of a railroad's marketing genius and the story of peoples whose country was repackaged for visitors. A labor memory that says even in an age of panics and corners, arbitration could write a better rule, and an accounting lesson, Hill's favorite, that a well-built mile pays interest in fairness as well as in cash. It shortens a trip, lowers a rate, and leaves a little more time at the end of a long day. Legacy is often confused with myth. Hill's nickname, the Empire Builder, sounds like brass and smoke. The reality is track alignment, culverts that don't heave, a wheat check that clears because the car actually moved, and a lodge balcony that frames a ridgeline sold as Switzerland. The human costs are real and must be spoken. Lives lost to weather and avalanche, cultures displaced or commodified, forest cut and land altered. Yet the through line is also real. The belief that physics, disciplined by prudence, could stitch scattered lives into a market large enough to matter. Stand at a Highline depot at dawn, and you can still feel it when an eastbound freight leans into the grade. Grain from the benches behind it, salt water ahead. That sound is not nostalgia. It is consequence. It is the echo of a blueprint that became a region and of a private dream that, for better and for worse, helped make a national market a daily fact. Finale. One immigrant's lesson. Roll the paper out one last time. The lines we have followed from levee to ledger to pass and pier are all here. No longer sketches, but a clean geometry that holds. What began with a young immigrant squinting at numbers in lamplight became a road that shortened time, tamed price, and taught distance to behave. The blueprint was never magic. It was discipline. Pick the corridor the land will accept. Shave the grade until one locomotive can do the work of two. Lay curves that respect momentum. Build only the miles you can keep full both ways. It was also nerve. Assemble capital without pledging the future to subsidies. Take wreckage and make it earn. Bet on towns you will have to help create. And it was patience. Surveys before slogans, traffic before triumph. A single life made this particular set of choices. James J. Hill did not charm a continent into coherence. He audited it into one. He learned on river timetables that a missed hour is a broken promise, on coal docks that energy is destiny, in freight houses that a price is a negotiation with physics. He carried those lessons into snow sheds and rate cases, onto bridges that had to stand, and into rooms where rivals and regulators measured ambition against law. When the plan met weather or panic, he bent with the season but did not let the road rot. When success tempted spectacle, he repeated the catechism, shorter, straighter, lighter, and spin on the parts you never see because they decide whether the visible parts work. The result was not merely a railroad. It was a network of obligations. Towns appeared because a siding and a water tank taught people where to gather. Markets synchronized because a timetable told grain when it would meet a hull and lumber when it would meet a bill of lading. Immigrants found land because colonist cars put them within a day's wagon of good soil. Even the laws changed shape around the new facts, private rate wars yielding to public rules, geometry learning to share the map with justice. The gains were tangible, checks that cleared, harvests that moved, winters that felt shorter because letters and goods outran the cold. So were the costs, lives lost to avalanche and error, landscapes altered, peoples pushed to the margins of their own country and then hired back as scenery for visitors. To speak only of triumph would be to redraw a dishonest map. Yet the lesson endures precisely because it refuses romance. Vision without discipline becomes a pamphlet. Discipline without vision becomes a ledger that never leaves the desk. Hill's gift was to keep both in hand. He understood that a nation could be rewired by a clean chain of good decisions. Choose the pass that lowers the lifetime bill. Place the siding where two trains can meet without stealing half an hour from the day. Refuse the mile that can never pay its way. Publish the tariff and keep the promise. Multiply such choices by years and crews and winters, and a scattered frontier becomes a market with a rhythm you can feel. Now look up from the paper. The blueprint resolves into a living map, steel lines glowing across the northern tier, pulsing with eastbound grain, westbound goods, and the quiet electricity of schedules kept. The stone arch throws its shadow across a river still at work. Marias and the Cascades hold their doors. A long train leans into a ruling grade and does not stall because someone, long ago, took 0.1% out of the climb. In towns that borrowed their names from backers and bosses and jokes that stuck, morning begins when a horn rolls the day forward. In a park sold as an alpine dream, a lodge balcony frames a ridgeline and a complicated history. On an ocean pier, a tide table and a switch list still agree. One immigrant's lesson is not that a single man built an empire. It is that vision, disciplined by physics and made real by networks of people, can bind oceans to farms and cities to seasons, and that such binding carries duties that do not end when the last spike is driven. Keep your line straight, keep your grade kind, keep your promises measurable. If you do, the country around the road will begin to act like a single place. Fold the paper, the lines remain, the continent hums.